Some sins don't wash away with rain or time. They carve themselves into flesh and bone. And when a man finds evil delivered to his doorstep wrapped in human skin, he learns that mercy and rage can live in the same breath. It was the kind of morning that felt wrong before anything happened. The air in the Colorado high country hung thick and still. No birdsong, no wind through the pines. Just a heaviness that pressed down on everything like the sky itself was holding its breath. Marcus Darkwater stood on the porch of his cabin, a tin cup of coffee steaming in his scarred hands, his dark eyes scanning the tree line out of habit more than concern. He had built this place with his own hands 7 years ago, logs he'd felled himself, stones he'd hauled up from the creek bed, every nail driven with the kind of precision that comes from wanting to be left alone. The cabin sat tucked into a fold of the Rockies, miles from the nearest settlement, accessible only by a narrow trail that most men wouldn't find, and fewer still would dare to follow. Marcus preferred it that way. He was half Cherokee on his mother's side, half Irish on his father's, and fully unwelcome in both worlds, so he'd made a third one here among the elk and the eagle and the endless silence. He trapped in winter, hunted year-round, and traded pelts twice a year in a town called Silver Hill, where the shopkeep knew better than to ask questions, and Marcus knew better than to stay longer than an hour. This morning should have been like any other. Check the traps, mend the fence line, maybe ride down to the creek to see if the beavers had returned. But when Marcus stepped off the porch, boots crunching on frost-hardened dirt, he saw it, a wagon, small, weathered, and sitting just inside his property line, near the split-rail fence he'd built to keep the deer out of his vegetable patch. No horse, no mule, nothing pulling it, just the wagon itself, tilted slightly to one side, like it had been abandoned in haste. Marcus set his coffee down on the porch rail and moved toward it, his hand instinctively brushing the handle of the Bowie knife, sheathed at his hip. He didn't run, didn't rush, just walked with the steady, deliberate pace of a man who had learned long ago that panic gets you killed faster than caution. As he approached, he noticed details that made his jaw tighten. The wagon wheels were caked with red clay mud, the kind that only came from the lowlands near the mining operations 40 miles south. The wood was splintered in places, the canvas cover torn and flapping loose on one side. There was something in the bed of the wagon. He could see the shape of it beneath the canvas, small, curved, unmistakably human. Marcus stopped 3 feet away, his breath coming slower now, controlled. He scanned the surrounding forest, looking for movement, for the glint of a rifle barrel, for anything that suggested this was a trap. Nothing, just trees and shadows and that unnatural silence. He stepped closer and reached for the canvas. His fingers brushed the coarse fabric, and that's when the smell hit him. Blood, old and dried, mixed with sweat and something else, something sharper, fear maybe, or infection. He pulled the canvas back slowly, inch by inch, and what he found beneath made his blood run cold. She was young. Maybe 22 or 23, with tangled auburn hair matted against her face and neck. Her dress, if you could still call it that, was torn and filthy, stained with dirt and blood and things Marcus didn't want to name. Her wrists were bound with rough hemp rope, the kind used for tying down cargo, and the skin beneath was raw and weeping. Her ankles were tied too, and her feet were bare, the soles cut and blistered, but it was her back that made Marcus's hands shake. The dress had been ripped open from collar to waist, exposing pale skin, crisscrossed with deep, deliberate lacerations. Some were old, scarred over and raised. Others were fresh, still seeping. They weren't random. They formed patterns, symbols maybe, or words. Marcus couldn't tell from this angle, but he knew one thing for certain. Someone had taken their time with her. Her eyes fluttered open, pale green and glassy with fever. She looked at him without surprise, without hope, just a dull recognition that another human being was standing over her. Her lips moved, cracked and bleeding, and when she spoke, her voice was barely a whisper, hoarse and broken. "You own me now. Do what you came for." Marcus didn't move. He didn't speak. He just stood there, staring down at this broken woman who had been delivered to his doorstep like a piece of furniture, like something bought and paid for. His mind raced, trying to piece together what kind of evil had brought her here, what kind of men would do this and think it was a transaction. Then he saw the note. It was pinned to the inside of the wagon bed with a rusted nail, a scrap of paper folded once and sealed with wax. Marcus pulled it free, unfolded it, and read the words scrawled in cramped, uneven handwriting. Debt settled. Property transferred. No refunds. Property. They called her property. Marcus felt something cold and old stir in his chest, something he'd buried years ago when he left the world of men behind. It wasn't anger, not yet. It was something quieter, sharper, the kind of rage that doesn't burn hot but freezes everything it touches. He folded the note carefully, tucked it into his coat pocket, and turned his attention back to the woman. She was watching him. Those pale green eyes tracking his movements with the wariness of a trapped animal. She flinched when he reached toward her, a full-body recoil that made the wagon creak beneath her weight. Marcus stopped, held his hands up where she could see them. Palms open, non-threatening. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said quietly, his voice low and steady, the same tone he used when approaching a wounded deer. "I'm going to cut those ropes. Then I'm going to carry you inside. You understand?" She didn't respond, didn't nod, didn't give any indication that she'd heard him. But she stopped flinching, and that was enough. Marcus drew his knife slowly, letting her see it, letting her understand what he was doing before he did it. He sliced through the rope at her wrists first, then her ankles, and the moment she was free, she curled into herself, arms wrapped around her knees, trembling. Marcus sheathed the knife and reached for her. She didn't fight, didn't resist, just let herself be lifted like a rag doll, all dead weight and sharp bones. She couldn't have weighed more than 90 pounds, and when Marcus cradled her against his chest, he could feel every rib, every vertebra pressing through her skin. He carried her toward the cabin, moving carefully, and as he climbed the porch steps, he glanced back at the wagon one last time. Whoever had left her here knew where he lived. They knew his name, or at least knew enough to find him. That meant this wasn't random. This was deliberate, calculated, and that made it 100 times more dangerous. Inside, the cabin was dim and cool, the fire in the hearth reduced to embers. Marcus kicked the door shut behind him and carried the woman to the back room, a small space he used for storage, lined with shelves holding jars of preserves, sacks of cornmeal, and bundles of dried herbs. There was a cot in the corner, a simple wooden frame with a straw mattress, and Marcus laid her down as gently as he could. She didn't make a sound, didn't cry out, just stared at the ceiling with those glassy eyes, breathing shallow and rapid. Marcus stepped back, giving her space, and for a moment he just stood there, unsure of what to do next. He'd patched up plenty of wounds in his time, gunshots, knife cuts, broken bones, but this was different. This wasn't just physical damage. This was something deeper, something that couldn't be stitched or bandaged. He turned and went to the kitchen, filled a basin with water from the barrel by the door, and grabbed a clean cloth from the shelf. When he returned, she hadn't moved, still staring at nothing, her chest rising and falling in shallow bursts. Marcus set the basin down beside the cot and dipped the cloth in the water, wringing it out. "I'm going to clean those wounds," he said, keeping his voice low and even. "It's going to hurt. But if I don't, infection will set in and you won't last 3 days. You understand?" Still no response. Marcus took that as permission and began to work. He started with her wrists, gently wiping away the dried blood and dirt, revealing the raw, angry flesh beneath. She flinched at the first touch, a sharp intake of breath, but she didn't pull away. Marcus worked slowly, methodically, cleaning each wound with care, his hands steady despite the fury building in his chest. When he moved to her back, he had to cut away what was left of her dress. And that's when he saw them clearly. The scars, deep, deliberate, carved with precision. They formed letters, words, a message burned into her skin with a blade. Marcus's jaw clenched as he read them. Whore, liar, worthless. Whoever had done this hadn't just hurt her. They'd tried to erase her, to reduce her to nothing more than the words they'd carved into her flesh. And they'd failed, because she was still breathing, still here, still fighting even if she didn't know it yet. Marcus finished cleaning the wounds, applied a salve made from comfrey root and beeswax, and wrapped her back in strips of clean linen. When he was done, he covered her with a wool blanket and stood, his hands still shaking. He walked to the door, stepped outside, and looked at the wagon again. The sun was higher now, burning off the morning chill, and the forest was waking up. Birds called from the treetops, a squirrel chattered somewhere in the pines. Everything was normal again, except for the wagon and the woman inside, and the note in Marcus's pocket that told him nothing would ever be normal again. He walked back to the wagon, grabbed the handles, and dragged it behind the cabin, where it couldn't be seen from the trail. Then he went to the barn, saddled his horse, a sturdy Appaloosa mare named Sage, and rode down to the creek. He needed to think, needed to figure out what came next, because one thing was certain. Whoever had left that woman at his door would come looking eventually. And when they did, Marcus Darkwater would be ready. When Marcus returned to the cabin 2 hours later, the sun had climbed high enough to cast sharp shadows through the pine branches, turning the forest floor into a patchwork of light and dark. He'd ridden hard down to the creek, following the water south for nearly 3 miles, looking for tracks, for signs of whoever had brought that wagon up the mountain. He found nothing. The ground was too hard, too rocky, and whoever had made the delivery knew how to cover their trail. That bothered him more than he wanted to admit. It meant professionals, or at least men experienced enough to move through wilderness without leaving a trace. It meant they'd been watching him, studying his patterns, knowing when he'd be alone and vulnerable. Marcus had made enemies over the years, men who didn't appreciate his mixed blood or his refusal to pick a side in the endless conflicts between settlers and tribes. But none of them had ever been this bold, this calculated. Autosis dosaiprisasti vidum. He dismounted near the barn, unsaddled Sage, and gave her a handful of oats before turning back toward the cabin. Smoke was rising from the chimney, thin and grey against the blue sky. He'd stoked the fire before leaving, wanting to keep the back room warm for the woman. Warmth helped with shock, helped keep the body from shutting down when it had been through trauma. Inside, the cabin smelled of wood smoke and the sharp herbal tang of the salve he'd applied. Marcus moved quietly toward the back room, not wanting to startle her if she was awake. He pushed the door open slowly and found her exactly as he'd left her, curled on her side beneath the wool blanket, eyes closed, breathing steady. For a moment he thought she might be sleeping, but then her eyes opened, tracking him as he stepped into the room. "You came back," she said, her voice still hoarse but stronger than before, as if the simple act of speaking required every ounce of strength she had left. Marcus nodded, crossed to the small table against the wall, and set down the leather satchel he'd brought in from the barn. Inside were more medical supplies, herbs his Cherokee grandmother had taught him to use, plants that grew only in certain parts of the high country, and only if you knew where to look. He pulled out a bundle of dried yarrow, a pouch of willow bark, and a small clay jar filled with honey. "I'm going to make you something for the pain," he said, not looking at her, focusing on the work. "And something to help you sleep. Real sleep, not the kind where you're half awake waiting for the next bad thing to happen." She didn't respond, just watched him with those pale green eyes, wary and calculating. Marcus moved to the hearth in the main room, hung a small iron pot over the fire, and filled it with water from the barrel. He crumbled the yarrow and willow bark into the water, added a spoonful of honey, and let it simmer while he prepared a plate of food. Cornbread left over from yesterday, a slice of smoked venison, and a handful of wild blackberries he'd picked last week. When the tea was ready, he poured it into a tin cup, carried it and the plate back to the small room, and set them both on the floor beside the cot. The woman hadn't moved, but her eyes followed his every motion, suspicious and alert. "You need to eat," Marcus said, gesturing to the plate. "And drink that. It'll help with the fever." She stared at the food like it might bite her, then slowly, painfully, pushed herself up into a sitting position. Her hands shook as she reached for the cup, and Marcus saw the fresh blood seeping through the bandages on her wrists. He'd have to change those soon, but not now. Not until she'd eaten and rested. She took a sip of the tea, grimaced at the bitterness, but kept drinking. When the cup was empty, she set it down and picked up a piece of cornbread, tearing off small bites and chewing slowly, mechanically, like eating was a chore she'd forgotten how to enjoy. Marcus watched her for a moment, then turned to leave, giving her privacy. "Why?" she asked, the words stopping him in the doorway. Marcus turned back, met her gaze. "Why what?" Why didn't you do it? What the note said. What they expected you to do." Marcus was quiet for a long moment, weighing his answer. Finally he said, "Because I'm not them." It was the simplest truth he had, and maybe the only one that mattered. He left the room, closed the door behind him, and stood in the main cabin staring at the fire. His hands were still shaking, not from fear, but from the effort it took to keep the rage buried, to keep it from spilling out and consuming everything in its path. He'd seen evil before. Plenty of it. He'd fought in skirmishes between army units and raiding parties, seen men scalped and gutted, seen women and children left to die in the snow. But this was different. This was cold, transactional, evil, dressed up as commerce, and it made his blood boil in a way nothing else ever had. Marcus walked to the window, looked out at the forest, and made a decision. Whoever had left that woman here thought they were done with her, thought they could wash their hands of whatever debt or crime had brought her to his door. They were wrong. Marcus didn't know her name yet, didn't know her story, but he knew one thing for certain. She was under his protection now, and anyone who came looking for her would have to go through him first. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters and sending pine needles skittering across the porch. Somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled, long and lonely, and Marcus felt the sound settle deep in his chest. The wilderness had its own justice, its own rules, and men who forgot that rarely lived long enough to regret it. He turned away from the window, poured himself another cup of coffee, and sat down at the table. There was work to be done, preparations to make, and questions that needed answering. But for now, all he could do was wait, keep the fire burning, and make sure the woman in the back room knew she was safe. Everything else would come in time. As the afternoon wore on, Marcus busied himself with small tasks, mending a tear in his coat, sharpening his knives, checking his rifle to make sure it was clean and loaded. He moved quietly, efficiently, the kind of work that kept his hands busy and his mind focused. Every so often he'd glance toward the back room, listening for sounds of distress. But there was only silence. By evening, the sun had dipped below the western ridge, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Marcus lit the oil lamps, fed the fire, and heated up a pot of venison stew he'd made 2 days ago. The smell filled the cabin, rich and savory, and for the first time all day, Marcus felt something like normalcy return. He filled a bowl, carried it to the back room, and knocked softly on the door before entering. The woman was awake, sitting up now, the blanket wrapped around her shoulders like a shawl. She looked at the bowl, then at Marcus, and for the first time he saw something other than fear in her eyes. Hunger, maybe, or just the faint stirring of hope. "Eat," Marcus said, setting the bowl on the table beside the cot. "You'll need your strength." She took the bowl, held it in both hands, and ate slowly, savoring each bite like it was the first real food she'd had in weeks. Marcus watched her for a moment, then nodded and left the room, closing the door behind him. He had his own dinner to eat, his own thoughts to sort through, and a long night ahead of him. Because out there in the darkness, somewhere beyond the reach of the firelight, men were planning, plotting, deciding what to do about the woman they'd lost and the man who'd taken her in. And when they came, Marcus Darkwater would be ready. The first 3 days passed in a rhythm of careful distance and unspoken understanding. Marianne Hollis didn't speak much beyond the bare necessities. A nod when Marcus brought food, a whispered thank you that seemed to cost her more than it should. Marcus didn't press her for conversation, didn't ask questions, didn't demand anything that might make her feel like she owed him more than she'd already been forced to give. He kept to his routines with deliberate consistency, rising before dawn to check the traps, returning mid-morning to tend the horses, spending afternoons chopping wood or mending gear. Every task was performed with visible predictability, his boots on the porch announcing his arrival, his movements through the cabin slow and telegraphed so she'd never be startled by his presence. Trust, Marcus understood, wasn't built with words or promises. It was built with patterns, with the steady proof that today would be like yesterday and tomorrow would be the same. On the second morning, when Marcus entered the back room with fresh bandages and a bowl of warm water, he found Marianne sitting upright on the cot, her feet on the floor, testing her weight. She'd managed to stand at some point during the night. He could tell from the way the blanket had been disturbed, from the faint scuff marks on the wooden floor where she'd steadied herself against the wall. She looked up when he entered, and for the first time there was something other than hollow resignation in her eyes. Defiance, maybe, or just the stubborn refusal to stay broken. "I can do it myself," she said, gesturing to the bandages in his hands. Her voice was stronger now. The fever had broken sometime in the night, and though she was still pale and gaunt, there was color returning to her cheeks. Marcus set the supplies on the small table and stepped back, giving her space. "All right," he said simply, and left the room without argument. He understood what she was really saying. She needed to reclaim something, anything, even if it was just the act of caring for her own wounds. Control, no matter how small, mattered when everything else had been stripped away. He heard her moving around in there for the better part of an hour, the soft rustle of fabric, the occasional sharp intake of breath when she touched a particularly tender spot. Marcus sat at the kitchen table cleaning his rifle, listening without intruding. When she finally emerged, she was wearing one of his old shirts, the sleeves rolled up past her elbows, the hem falling almost to her knees. She'd managed to wash her face and hands, and though her hair was still tangled, she tied it back with a strip of cloth. She stood in the doorway, swaying slightly, one hand braced against the frame for support. Marcus looked up from his work, met her gaze, and waited. She didn't speak right away, just studied him with those pale green eyes, measuring, calculating, trying to figure out what kind of man he really was. "I need to know your name," she said finally, her voice quiet but firm. "If I'm going to stay here, I need to know who you are." Marcus set the rifle down, wiped his hands on a rag and stood. "Marcus Darkwater," he said. "This is my land, has been for 7 years." She nodded slowly, processing this information. "Marianne Hollis," she said after a pause, as if testing the sound of her own name, as if she hadn't spoken it aloud in so long that it felt foreign on her tongue. "They called me other things, but that's who I am, Marianne." Marcus inclined his head in acknowledgement. "Marianne?" he repeated, giving the name weight, respect, the simple dignity of being heard and recognized. "You hungry?" She hesitated, then nodded. Marcus gestured to the table, pulled out a chair for her, and moved to the stove where a pot of oatmeal was warming. He ladled 2 bowls, added a spoonful of honey to each, and set one in front of her before taking his seat across the table. They ate in silence, but it wasn't the heavy, suffocating silence of the first days. This was different, easier, the kind of quiet that exists between 2 people who don't need to fill every moment with noise. When Marianne finished, she set her spoon down carefully and looked at Marcus with an expression he couldn't quite read. "Why did they bring me here?" she asked. "Why you?" Marcus had been expecting this question, had spent the last 3 days turning it over in his mind, trying to make sense of it. "I don't know," he admitted. "The note said debt settled, property transferred. But I never made any agreement, never bought or traded for anything that would explain this. My best guess is someone thinks I did, or someone wants me to think I did. Either way, it's meant to put me in a position." Marianne's jaw tightened. "A position," she repeated, and there was something bitter and sharp in her tone. "You mean they're trying to make you complicit? If you keep me, you're accepting their terms. If you turn me out, you're sending me back to them. Either way, they win." Marcus nodded slowly. She was sharper than he'd expected. able to see the trap even through the fog of her own trauma. "That's about the shape of it," he said. "But they made one mistake." What's that?" "Like they assumed I'd play by their rules." Marianne stared at him for a long moment, and then, for the first time since she'd arrived, something shifted in her expression. Not quite a smile, but close, a faint easing of the tension in her features, as if some small part of her dared to believe that maybe, just maybe, she'd landed somewhere different than all the other places she'd been. Over the following days, Marianne began to venture outside the back room more frequently. At first, it was just to sit by the fire, wrapped in the wool blanket, staring into the flames while Marcus worked at the table or prepared meals. She didn't offer to help, and Marcus didn't ask her to. He understood that healing wasn't linear, that some days she'd have strength and others she'd barely be able to lift her head from the pillow. But on the 5th day, Marcus came in from checking the traps to find Marianne standing at the stove, stirring a pot of beans she'd somehow managed to prepare while he was gone. The effort had clearly cost her. She was trembling from exertion, her face pale and drawn, but there was a determined set to her jaw that told Marcus she wasn't going to stop just because it hurt. "You didn't have to do that," Marcus said, setting his rifle by the door and crossing to the stove. He took the wooden spoon from her hand gently, not in rebuke but in assistance, and gestured for her to sit. "But I appreciate it." Marianne sank into the chair with visible relief, her breath coming in short gasps. "I can't just sit there," she said, frustration edging her voice. "I can't just take and give nothing back. It makes me feel like I'm still what they said I was." Marcus ladled the beans into 2 bowls, added a chunk of cornbread to each, and set one in front of her. He sat down across from her, considered his words carefully, and then spoke with the same quiet firmness he used when gentling a spooked horse. "You're healing," he said. "That's not nothing. That's everything. When you're strong enough, there'll be plenty to do around here. But until then, you don't owe me anything. Not work, not gratitude, not explanations. You're here because you need to be, and that's reason enough." Marianne looked down at her bowl, blinking rapidly, and Marcus realized with a start that she was fighting tears. He turned his attention to his own food, giving her space to compose herself, and they ate in that careful, respectful silence that had become their shared language. That night, Marcus woke to the sound of screaming. He was on his feet before his mind fully registered what was happening, rifle in hand, scanning the darkened cabin for threats. It took him a moment to realize the sound was coming from the back room, and another moment to understand that it wasn't a physical threat, but something worse. The kind of danger that lived inside a person's mind and came out when they closed their eyes. He set the rifle down and moved to the back room, knocked once and pushed the door open. Marianne was thrashing on the cot, tangled in the blanket, her face contorted in terror, still asleep, but fighting something only she could see. Marcus crossed the room quickly, knelt beside the cot, and spoke her name, low and steady, not touching her, just letting his voice be an anchor. "Marianne, you're safe. You're in the cabin. Nobody's here but me. You're safe." He repeated it like a litany over and over, until finally her eyes snapped open, wild and unfocused. For a moment she didn't recognize him, didn't know where she was, and Marcus saw her hand scramble for something, anything she could use as a weapon. He stayed perfectly still, kept his voice calm and even. "It's Marcus. You're in my cabin. You're safe." Recognition dawned slowly, and with it came the crushing weight of reality. Marianne's face crumpled, and she curled into herself, pulling her knees to her chest, shaking with silent sobs. Marcus wanted to reach out, to offer comfort, but he knew better. Touch right now would only make it worse. So he did the only thing he could do. He stayed. He sat on the floor beside the cot, his back against the wall, and he stayed. "I can't make them stop," Marianne whispered after a long while, her voice raw and broken. "I close my eyes and they're there. Every time. Every single time." Marcus didn't offer empty platitudes, didn't tell her it would get better, or that time heals all wounds. He'd lived long enough to know that some wounds don't heal, they just scar over, and the best you can hope for is to learn how to carry them. Instead, he said, I'm not going anywhere. If you need someone to sit with you, I'll sit. If you need quiet, I'll give you quiet. Whatever you need, as long as you're under this roof, you've got it. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Marianne didn't respond, just pulled the blanket tighter around herself and stared at the wall. Marcus sat there for another hour, maybe 2, until her breathing evened out and she drifted back into an uneasy sleep. Only then did he return to his own bed, though he didn't sleep much after that. He kept one ear tuned to the back room, listening for any sign that the nightmares had returned. By the end of the first week, a tentative routine had established itself. Marcus rose early, made coffee, and left a cup by Marianne's door before heading out to tend the land. When he returned, she'd usually be up, moving slowly around the cabin, sometimes preparing food, sometimes just sitting by the fire. They spoke little, but the silences were no longer oppressive. They were simply the space between two people learning how to exist in the same orbit without collision. Marianne's physical wounds were healing, the deep lacerations on her back beginning to close, the rope burns on her wrists fading to pink. But Marcus could see the other wounds, the ones that didn't show, in the way she startled at sudden noises, in the way she positioned herself with her back to the wall whenever possible, in the way her hand sometimes drifted unconsciously to her side, as if reaching for a weapon that wasn't there. On the 8th day, Marcus came back from the creek to find Marianne outside for the first time. She was standing on the porch, one hand on the railing for support, her face tilted toward the sun. She looked so small standing there, dwarfed by the mountains rising behind her, by the vast expanse of forest stretching in every direction. But there was something in her posture, a straightness to her spine, that suggested she was reclaiming herself one piece at a time. Marcus approached slowly, making sure his boots were loud on the dirt path, giving her plenty of warning. She turned when she heard him, and there was something different in her eyes. Not happiness, not yet, but something like determination. I want to learn how to shoot, she said without preamble, her voice steady and clear. If someone comes, I want to be able to fight back. I won't be helpless again. Marcus considered this, studied her face, and saw that she meant every word. This wasn't a request born of fear or panic. This was calculation, preparation, the decision of someone who'd looked death in the face and decided they'd rather go down swinging. He respected that. All right, he said. Tomorrow morning after you've eaten. We'll start with the basics. Marianne nodded, and for the first time since she'd arrived, Marcus saw a flicker of something that might have been relief. She was taking back control, defining her own terms. And that was more powerful than any medicine Marcus could offer. That evening, as they sat across from each other at the table, eating a simple dinner of fried trout and wild onions, Marcus found himself studying Marianne with new eyes. She wasn't just a victim anymore, wasn't just a broken thing that needed fixing. She was becoming something else, something harder, forged in the fire of whatever hell she'd survived. And Marcus realized, with a strange certainty, that whoever had left her at his door had made a catastrophic miscalculation. They'd thought they were disposing of a problem, discarding something they no longer wanted. But what they'd actually done was create an enemy, and enemies had a way of coming back when you least expected it. As the fire burned low and the night settled around them, Marcus poured 2 cups of bitter chicory coffee and slid one across the table to Marianne. She accepted it with a nod of thanks, wrapped her hands around the warm cup, and stared into the dark liquid, as if looking for answers. "Marcus," she said quietly, not looking up. "When they come, and they will come, are you going to let them take me?" Marcus didn't hesitate. "No, even if it means trouble, even if it means they bring guns and men and fire." "Especially then." Marianne finally looked up, met his gaze across the table, and Marcus saw the weight of that answer settle on her shoulders. Not as burden, but as something else, something that might have been trust. The morning Marcus taught Marianne to shoot started with fog so thick you could barely see 10 feet in any direction. It rolled down from the high peaks like something alive, swallowing the pines and turning the world into a grey, formless void. Marcus stood on the porch, coffee cooling in his hand, watching the mist shift and swirl, and felt an old familiar tension settle between his shoulder blades. Weather like this made men careless, made them think they were hidden when they were just blind. Marianne emerged from the cabin dressed in clothes Marcus had given her. A pair of his old canvas trousers cinched tight with rope, a wool shirt that hung loose on her thin frame, and a leather vest she'd found in the storage room. She looked like a child playing dress-up in her father's wardrobe, but there was nothing childish in her eyes. They were sharp, focused, burning with the kind of intensity that came from having something to prove. "Is the fog a problem?" she asked, stepping up beside him, her breath visible in the cold morning air. Marcus shook his head. "Makes it harder to see targets at distance, but we're starting close anyway. Come on." He led her down from the cabin to a clearing about 50 yards south, a flat stretch of land bordered by thick pine on 3 sides. Marcus had set up a makeshift range here years ago, nothing fancy, just a berm of packed earth with various objects propped against it at different distances. Today, he'd arranged 3 wooden posts at intervals of 10, 20 and 30 feet, each one marked with a strip of white cloth so they'd be visible through the fog. Marcus carried his Henry rifle and his Colt revolver, both weapons he knew intimately could field strip and reassemble in the dark. He set the rifle against a nearby stump and drew the Colt, checking the cylinder out of habit even though he knew it was loaded and clean. Marianne watched his every movement with the careful attention of someone who understood that details mattered, that the difference between life and death could come down to knowing which way a cylinder rotated. "First thing you need to understand," Marcus said, holding the revolver so she could see it clearly, "is that a gun is a tool. Nothing more, nothing less. It's not magic. It won't protect you just because you're holding it. It'll only do what you make it do, and that requires practice, patience, and respect. You treat it carelessly, it'll kill you as quick as it'll kill anyone else." Marianne nodded, her eyes never leaving the weapon. Marcus continued, walking her through the basics, how to check if it was loaded, how to engage and disengage the safety, how to hold it with both hands to manage the recoil. He demonstrated the proper stance, feet shoulder-width apart, knees slightly bent, arms extended but not locked. Then he fired once at the nearest post, the shot cracking through the fog like a whip, and the white cloth fluttered where the bullet struck 2 inches left of center. "Your turn," Marcus said, engaging the safety and handing her the revolver grip first. Marianne took it with both hands, and Marcus saw her fingers tremble slightly as they wrapped around the wood. Not from fear, he thought, but from the sheer weight of what this represented. She'd been powerless for so long, and now she held something that could equalize any fight, that could make the smallest person as dangerous as the largest. It was intoxicating and terrifying in equal measure. Marcus moved behind her, close enough to guide, but not so close as to crowd. "Stand like I showed you," he said quietly. "Feet apart, weight balanced. Now raise the gun, both hands. Keep your arms firm but not rigid. Look down the barrel, line up the front sight with the rear sight, and put both of those on your target." Marianne did as instructed, her movements careful and deliberate. Marcus could see the concentration etched into every line of her body, the way she bit her lower lip, the way her shoulders tensed with effort. "Now breathe," he said. "In through your nose, out through your mouth. On your next exhale, squeeze the trigger, don't pull it, squeeze it smooth and steady." She breathed once, twice, and on the third exhale she squeezed. The gun roared, the recoil driving her arms up and back, and she stumbled a step before catching herself. The bullet went wide, kicking up dirt 5 feet to the right of the target post. Marianne's face fell, frustration and disappointment warring in her expression. "Again," Marcus said, taking the gun and showing her how to cock the hammer for the next shot. "You jerked at the last second, pulled to the right. Keep your focus on the sight, not on what happens after you shoot." The bullet's already gone. Worrying about it won't change anything. They spent the next hour working through the fundamentals, shot after shot, each one a little better than the last. The fog began to lift as the sun climbed higher, burning away the grey and revealing the mountains in all their stark, brutal beauty. Marianne's arms ached. Marcus could see it in the way she lowered the gun between shots, in the way she rolled her shoulders trying to work out the tension. But she didn't complain, didn't ask to stop. Just kept firing until the cylinder was empty, and then watched intently as Marcus showed her how to reload. By the time they finished, Marianne had managed to hit the nearest post 3 times out of 12 shots. Not impressive by any measure, but a start. More importantly, she'd learned to control the flinch, to keep her eyes open when she pulled the trigger, to trust that the gun would do what it was designed to do. Marcus could see the exhaustion in her face, the way her hands shook from fatigue. But he could also see something else, a fierce satisfaction, the knowledge that she'd taken one more step away from helplessness. They walked back to the cabin in comfortable silence, the kind that came after shared effort, and when Marianne finally spoke, her voice was thoughtful, measured. "How many men have you killed?" she asked, not looking at him, keeping her eyes on the path ahead. Marcus had expected this question eventually, knew it would come the moment he put a gun in her hands. He considered his answer carefully, aware that honesty here mattered more than comfort. "Enough," he said finally. "Some in battle, some in self-defense, 1 or 2 that probably could have been avoided if I'd been smarter or faster with my words. Every one of them stays with you, Marianne. Every face, every moment. Killing isn't something you get used to, it's something you learn to carry." Marianne absorbed this in silence, and they continued up the path to the cabin. Once inside, Marcus put coffee on to boil, while Marianne collapsed into a chair at the table, her arms draped across the worn wood, her head resting on her forearms. She looked utterly spent, wrung out in a way that went beyond physical exhaustion. "I need to tell you what happened," she said suddenly, her voice muffled against her arms. "I need you to know why they brought me here, why any of this is happening." Marcus poured 2 cups of coffee, set one in front of her, and sat down across the table. He didn't speak, didn't prompt her, just waited. Some stories couldn't be rushed. They had to be given in their own time, on their own terms. Marianne lifted her head, wrapped her hands around the warm cup, and stared into the dark liquid as if it might give her courage. When she finally began to speak, her voice was low and steady, each word chosen with care. Each sentence a small act of defiance against the silence that had held her captive for so long. "I grew up in Kansas," she said. "Small town called Meridian, nothing special. Just farms and churches and people who thought they knew the mind of God. My father was a preacher, my mother died when I was 7, and I learned early that being a preacher's daughter meant you lived in a glass house where everyone could see your sins, but nobody noticed their own." She paused, took a sip of coffee, her hands still trembling slightly. Marcus waited, giving her space to continue at her own pace. "When I was 17, a man came to town. His name was Charles Pemberton, and he was everything my father wasn't. Wealthy, educated, charming in a way that made you feel special just by being in the same room. He was in Meridian on business, something to do with mining claims and railroad rights, and he stayed at the boarding house across from the church. He came to services every Sunday, always sat in the front pew, always made a point of complimenting my father's sermons." Marianne's voice had gone flat, emotionless. The way people talk when they're describing something that happened to someone else, something they've distanced themselves from, just to survive the telling. "He started courting me, brought flowers, wrote letters, took me on chaperoned walks through town. My father approved, thought Pemberton was a godsend, a respectable man who could give me a life better than anything Meridian had to offer. And I believed it, believed him, because I was 17 and stupid and desperate to be anywhere but that glass house." She set the cup down, pressed her palms flat against the table as if bracing herself for what came next. "We were married 3 months later, small ceremony in my father's church. And Pemberton took me to Denver, where he had a house on Capitol Hill, one of those big Victorian mansions with servants and gas lights and more rooms than any two people could ever need. For about a month, it was everything he'd promised: parties, theater, fine dresses, the whole performance. Marcus saw her jaw tighten, saw the muscles in her neck cord with tension. Then the mask came off. Pemberton wasn't a businessman. He was a speculator, a con man who made his money convincing investors to fund ventures that didn't exist. He was also a drunk, a mean one, the kind who needed someone to blame when his schemes fell apart. That someone was me. She pulled her hands back, folded them in her lap, and Marcus could see her fingers twisting together, knotting and unknotting in a restless, unconscious gesture. The first time he hit me, he apologized after cried, swore it would never happen again. The second time, he didn't bother apologizing. By the third time, I'd learned to see it coming, learned to read the signs, the way his voice changed, the way his hands curled into fists. But knowing doesn't help when you've got nowhere to go and no one who'll believe you. Marcus felt that cold rage stirring again, the same feeling he'd had when he first read the note pinned to the wagon. He kept his face neutral, his voice calm. "How long were you with him?" he asked. 3 years, Marianne said, and there was a bitter edge to her voice now, self-directed anger for not leaving sooner, for not fighting back harder. 3 years of playing the dutiful wife in public while collecting bruises in private. I tried to leave twice. The first time he found me at the train station and dragged me back, told everyone I'd had a nervous episode. The second time, I made it as far as Cheyenne before his men caught up with me. After that, he stopped pretending to be civilized. She looked up then, met Marcus's eyes directly, and he saw the full weight of what she'd endured written in her gaze. He kept me locked in the house, posted guards at the doors, told the servants I was ill and not to be disturbed. The beatings got worse, more frequent, and he started inviting friends over, other men like him, men with money and no morals. They'd drink and gamble in the parlor while I was kept upstairs, and sometimes when Pemberton lost big, he'd offer me as collateral. Marcus's hands clenched into fists beneath the table, but he kept his voice level. "The scars on your back," he said quietly. Marianne nodded, her face pale but composed. "One of his friends, a railroad baron named Garrett Sullivan, he was the one who did that. Pemberton owed him $20,000, couldn't pay, so he offered me instead, said Sullivan could do whatever he wanted as long as I was returned alive. Sullivan took his time, 3 days, and when he was finished, he had his men carve those words into my back with a heated blade. His way of marking property. The words hung in the air between them, ugly and undeniable, and Marcus felt his control slipping, felt the rage threatening to break through the careful walls he'd built around it. He stood abruptly, walked to the window, pressed his forehead against the cool glass, and forced himself to breathe. "How did you end up here?" he asked, his voice rough, strained. "Pemberton's luck finally ran out," Marianne said. "He got caught running a scheme involving fraudulent mining stocks, federal charges, the kind that come with prison time. He fled Denver, took me with him, trying to stay ahead of the marshals. We ended up in some mountain town. I don't even remember the name, just that it was cold and miserable and full of men who looked at me like I was something they could buy. Pemberton tried to sell me outright, found some trader who dealt in human cargo, girls for brothels and work camps mostly. The trader paid him $500, loaded me in that wagon, and that's the last I saw of Charles Pemberton." She paused, her voice wavering for the first time. "The trader said he had a buyer lined up, someone who'd paid in advance for delivery, someone who lived alone and wouldn't ask questions. He drove for 2 days, maybe 3, I lost track of time. Then one morning he just stopped, pulled the wagon up to a cabin, read the name on a piece of paper, and left me there. The note said you'd paid for me, said the debt was settled. I thought you were just another one of them. Another man who'd bought himself a plaything." Marcus turned from the window, looked at Marianne sitting there at his table, small and exhausted and impossibly brave for having survived all of it. "I never paid for anything," he said quietly. I don't know why they use my name, don't know what game they're playing. But I promise you this, Marianne Hollis, you're not property, you're not debt, and you're sure as hell not anyone's plaything. You're a person, and that means you get to decide what happens next." Marianne's eyes glistened, and she looked away quickly, blinking hard. "What if I don't know what happens next?" she asked, her voice small and uncertain. "Then you stay here until you figure it out," Marcus said. "And in the meantime, we make sure you're strong enough that nobody can take that choice away from you again." They sat in silence for a long while after that, the weight of Marianne's story settling over the cabin like snow, heavy and muffling. Marcus poured more coffee, stoked the fire, and tried to process everything he'd learned. The pieces were starting to fit together now. The note, the wagon, the calculated cruelty of it all. Someone had used Marianne to send a message, or to set a trap, or both. The question was who, and more importantly, why Marcus? As the afternoon wore on, Marianne retreated to the back room to rest, and Marcus sat at the table with pen and paper, writing down everything she'd told him, every name, every detail that might prove useful later. Charles Pemberton, Garrett Sullivan, the unnamed trader who delivered her like cargo. These were leads, threads he could pull if he was careful, if he was smart. But first, he needed to make sure Marianne was safe, truly safe. Not just hidden away in a cabin, but prepared to defend herself if the worst happened. Teaching her to shoot was a start, but it wasn't enough. She needed to know how to move through the wilderness, how to track and hunt, how to survive alone if she had to. Marcus had lived his whole life on the edges of civilization, had learned from his Cherokee mother and his Irish father how to read the land, how to become part of it rather than fighting against it. He could teach Marianne those things, could give her the tools to reclaim not just her body, but her autonomy. That evening, when Marianne emerged from the back room, Marcus had a simple dinner waiting, roasted rabbit and root vegetables. Nothing fancy but filling and warm. They ate together, and for the first time since she'd arrived, the silence between them wasn't heavy with unspoken trauma or careful politeness. It was just silence, comfortable and easy, the kind that exists between two people who've begun to trust each other. After dinner, Marianne helped clean the dishes, moving slowly but surely, and when they were done, she turned to Marcus with a question that seemed to have been building in her all day. "Why are you helping me?" she asked. "You don't know me, don't owe me anything. You could have sent me away, could have taken me to town and let someone else deal with it. Why didn't you?" Marcus dried his hands on a cloth, considered his answer. "My mother was Cherokee," he said finally. "When I was a boy, maybe 8 or 9, soldiers came through our camp looking for runaways from the reservation. They found a girl hiding in our lodge, couldn't have been more than 12, and they were going to take her back, chain her up like an animal. My mother stood between them and that girl, told them they'd have to go through her first." He paused, the memory still vivid after all these years. "The soldiers left without the girl. Not because my mother was intimidating, but because she made them see what they were doing, made them face the choice they were making. She told me later that sometimes the most important thing you can do is stand between cruelty and its victim, not because you'll win, not because it'll change the world, but because somebody has to, because bearing witness matters." Marianne listened, absorbing this, and when Marcus finished, she nodded slowly. "Your mother sounds like she was a good woman," she said quietly. "She was," Marcus agreed. "And she'd have done for you exactly what I'm doing now. No hesitation, no questions asked." They stood there in the fading light, two people bound together by circumstance and choice, and Marcus realized that somewhere in the last 10 days, this had stopped being about obligation or decency and had become something else entirely, a partnership forged in shared purpose, in the simple recognition that some things were worth fighting for, even when the odds were stacked against you. 2 weeks after Marianne's arrival, Marcus woke to the sound of horses on the mountain trail. It was the kind of sound that didn't belong in his world, multiple animals moving in coordination, their hooves striking rock in a rhythm that spoke of purpose and numbers. He was dressed and armed before his eyes had fully adjusted to the pre-dawn darkness, his Colt strapped to his hip, his Henry rifle in hand, moving through the cabin with the silent efficiency of a man who'd prepared for this moment since the day he found that wagon. Marianne was already awake, sitting upright on her cot, her face pale in the dim light filtering through the window. She'd heard it too, recognized the threat in that distant sound. Marcus moved to her doorway, kept his voice low and calm. "Get dressed, warm clothes, boots. Take the revolver from the drawer and the ammunition pouch beside it. If shooting starts, you go out the back window and head northeast into the heavy timber. There's a cave about 2 miles up, hidden behind a rockfall. You remember the landmarks I showed you?" Marianne nodded, her hands already moving to pull on the clothes she'd laid out the night before, part of the contingency plan they'd discussed but hoped never to use. "What about you?" she asked, her voice steady despite the fear Marcus could see in her eyes. "I'll buy you time," Marcus said simply. "Now move." He left her to prepare and went to the main room, positioned himself at the window where he had a clear view of the approach trail. The sky was beginning to lighten in the east, that grey pre-dawn glow that made everything look washed out and unreal. Marcus counted 4 riders, maybe 5, moving in a tight group up the narrow path. They were taking their time, not rushing, which told him they were either confident or cautious, possibly both. When they were close enough for Marcus to make out details, he felt his jaw tighten. The lead rider was a big man, broad-shouldered and thick through the middle, wearing a long duster coat and a wide-brimmed hat pulled low. Even from a distance, Marcus could see the gun belt strapped across his chest, the rifle scabbard on his saddle. The men behind him were cut from similar cloth, hard-looking characters with the kind of faces you found in mining camps and railroad towns. Men who did ugly work for money and didn't lose sleep over it. They stopped about 50 yards from the cabin, just outside effective pistol range but well within rifle distance. The lead rider dismounted, handed his reins to one of the others, and walked forward alone, his hands visible and empty. Marcus recognized the gesture, a show of peaceful intent that meant absolutely nothing when you had 4 armed men at your back. He watched the man approach, tracking him down the barrel of his rifle. Finger resting lightly on the trigger guard, the man stopped 20 feet from the porch, close enough to talk without shouting, far enough to make a quick retreat if things went wrong. He was older than Marcus had first thought, maybe 50, with a grey, streaked beard and eyes that had seen too much and felt too little. When he spoke, his voice carried the flat, affectless tone of someone stating facts rather than making threats. "Morning," the man said. "Name's Clayton Wade. I'm here on behalf of Mr. Garrett Sullivan of Denver. I believe you have something that belongs to him." Marcus didn't lower the rifle, didn't move from his position behind the window frame. "I don't know any Garrett Sullivan," he called back, his voice carrying clear and cold across the distance. "And I don't have anything that belongs to anybody but me." Wade's expression didn't change, but Marcus saw something flicker in those dead eyes. Calculation, maybe, or just the recognition that this wasn't going to be easy. "Now, I think we both know that's not entirely true," Wade said. "About 2 weeks ago, property was delivered to this location, transferred legally, and paid for in advance. Mr. Sullivan has documentation showing clear chain of ownership. All we want is to collect what's ours and be on our way. Nobody needs to get hurt." Marcus felt the rage building again, that cold fury that had been simmering since he'd first read those words carved into Marianne's back. "Property," he said, and his voice had gone quiet, dangerous. "You call a human being property?" Wade shrugged, a casual gesture that somehow made him more menacing. "I don't make the rules, friend. I just enforce them. Now you can make this easy and send her out, or you can make it hard. Either way, we're not leaving without her." "Then you're not leaving," Marcus said, and he raised the rifle to his shoulder, sighting down the barrel at Wade's chest. "Because she's not going anywhere with you." For a long moment, nobody moved. Wade stood there in the growing light, weighing his options, measuring the distance between himself and cover, calculating odds. Finally, he took a slow step backward, then another, his hands still visible. "That's a mistake," he said, his voice still flat, still emotionless. Mr. Sullivan doesn't accept mistakes kindly. You've got until noon to reconsider. After that, we come in and take what's ours, and whatever happens is on your head." He turned and walked back to his horse, mounted up, and the group retreated down the trail, disappearing into the trees. Marcus watched them go, his rifle still raised, his body tense and ready. Only when they were completely out of sight did he lower the weapon and step away from the window. Marianne emerged from the back room, fully dressed, the Colt revolver held properly in both hands, her face set in grim determination. "They're coming back," she said, and it wasn't a question. Marcus nodded. "Before noon, probably sooner. Wade's type doesn't like waiting, doesn't like having his authority challenged. He'll try to make an example, show everyone else what happens when you refuse to cooperate." "Then we should leave," Marianne said. "Get ahead of them, lose them in the mountains." Marcus considered this, weighed the tactical advantages of retreat versus defense. "We could try," he said slowly. "But they know this country now, or at least they know enough. They'll track us, run us down eventually. And out there in open terrain, their numbers give them too much advantage. Here we've got walls, cover, high ground. We've got a chance." Marianne absorbed this, her fingers tightening on the revolver grip. "So we fight," she said. "We fight," Marcus confirmed. "But smart, not desperate. They want you alive, that's our edge. They'll try to take the cabin without burning it, try to flush us out rather than kill us outright. That gives us options, room to maneuver." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story. He moved through the cabin quickly, securing shutters, checking ammunition stores, filling water buckets in case of fire. Marianne helped without being asked, her movements efficient and purposeful, the fear still there but controlled, channeled into action. Marcus had taught her well over the past 2 weeks. Not just shooting, but tactics, how to think under pressure, how to read a situation and respond rather than react. By the time the sun had fully cleared the eastern peaks, they were as ready as they could be. Marcus had positioned spare rifles at different windows, created firing lanes that covered all approaches to the cabin. He'd moved furniture to create barriers, turned the main room into a defensive position that would force any attackers to fight for every inch of ground. It wasn't perfect, nothing ever was, but it would have to do. They waited in silence, Marcus at the front window, Marianne at the side, both of them watching the tree line for movement. The morning stretched out, each minute feeling like an hour, the tension building until Marcus could feel it in his teeth, in the tightness of his jaw. When the attack came, it came faster than he expected. No warning, no second chance to surrender. Just the sudden crack of rifle fire and the sound of breaking glass as bullets punched through the cabin walls. Marcus dropped below the window line, pulled Marianne down with him, and felt splinters rain down from the rafters overhead. The shooting continued for maybe 30 seconds, a sustained volley designed to pin them down and test their defenses. Then silence, broken only by the ringing in Marcus's ears and the sound of Marianne's rapid breathing beside him. "You hit?" Marcus asked, checking her quickly for wounds. "No," Marianne said, and her voice was remarkably steady. "But they're not playing anymore." Marcus nodded, risked a quick glance out the window, and spotted movement in the trees, figures darting between cover, working their way closer to the cabin. He counted positions, estimated distances, and formulated a plan. "They're going to try to rush us," he said. "Probably split into 2 groups, hit us from different angles at the same time. When they come, pick your targets carefully. Don't waste ammunition, and whatever you do, don't let them get inside." Marianne moved to her window, checked the loads in her revolver, and settled into the stance Marcus had drilled into her over hours of practice. Her hands were steady, her breathing controlled, and Marcus felt a flicker of pride mixed with the fear. She'd come a long way from the broken woman in the wagon. The rush came from the north and west simultaneously, 2 men from each direction, moving fast and low, using the terrain for cover. Marcus fired first, his Henry rifle barking once, twice, and the lead man on the north side went down hard, clutching his leg. The others scattered, diving behind trees and rocks, and Marcus heard Marianne's Colt fire from her position. Saw splinters fly from a tree trunk where one of the Western attackers had taken cover. The firefight settled into a brutal rhythm, attackers moving forward under covering fire, defenders responding with carefully aimed shots, each side testing the other's resolve. Marcus worked his rifle with mechanical precision, firing, levering, firing again, placing shots not to kill, but to suppress, to keep the attackers pinned and unable to advance. Beside him, Marianne was doing the same, her earlier training showing in the way she controlled her breathing, managed her recoil, conserved her ammunition. A bullet punched through the window frame, inches from Marcus's head, and he felt the sting of wood splinters across his cheek. He shifted position, moved to a different window, and spotted Wade directing his men from behind a large boulder. The man was smart, staying out of the direct line of fire, using his people as expendable resources. Marcus lined up a shot, led the target slightly, and squeezed the trigger. The bullet sparked off the boulder right where Wade's head had been a second before, and the man jerked back, retreating deeper into cover. The attack broke off suddenly, the shooting stopping as quickly as it had started. Marcus counted heartbeats, listening for movement, and heard the sounds of men retreating, moving back toward their horses. He risked another look and saw them regrouping at the tree line. 3 men still standing plus Wade, which meant at least one was down, possibly dead. It wasn't a victory, not really, but it was a message. Taking this cabin would cost more than Wade had probably expected. Why are they stopping? Marianne asked, her voice tight with adrenaline. Marcus reloaded his rifle, his hands moving automatically through the familiar motions. Reassessing, he said. They thought we'd be easy, thought maybe I'd be alone and unprepared. No, they know different, and Wade's trying to decide if it's worth the cost. Men like him, they think in terms of profit and loss. Right now, the loss column is starting to look too big, but even as he said it, Marcus knew they weren't done. Wade had come too far, invested too much time and reputation to walk away empty-handed. He'd try something else, something different, and Marcus needed to be ready for it. The answer came an hour later, drifting up from the valley below, in a voice that carried clear and cold through the mountain air. Wade was using a speaking trumpet, amplifying his words so they couldn't be ignored. "Darkwater," he called. "Let's talk terms. You've made your point, shown you're not easy prey. I respect that. But this ends one of 2 ways. You give us the girl and walk away with your life, or we burn you out and take her from the ashes. Your choice." Marcus moved to the door, cracked it open enough to project his voice without exposing himself. "I've got a third option," he shouted back. "You leave now, go back to Sullivan, and tell him his property is emancipated. Tell him if he wants her, he can come get her himself, face to face, man to man. No hired guns, no middlemen." There was a long pause, and Marcus could almost hear Wade's teeth grinding from here. When the man spoke again, his voice had lost some of that flat calm, replaced by an edge of genuine anger. "You're a fool, Darkwater. Sullivan doesn't negotiate, doesn't compromise. You're just making this worse for everyone, especially for her." Marcus felt Marianne move up beside him, the Colt still in her hands, her face set in hard lines. She looked at Marcus, a question in her eyes, and he gave her a small nod. She stepped forward, raised her voice so it would carry. "Tell Sullivan," she called out, and her voice rang clear and strong across the distance, that Marianne Hollis is nobody's property anymore. "Tell him the girl he broke is gone, and what's left doesn't scare easy. Tell him if he wants me, he'll have to kill me, because I'm never going back." The silence that followed was absolute, heavy with the weight of that declaration. Marcus saw Wade step out from behind his boulder, staring up at the cabin with an expression that might have been surprise or respect or just cold calculation. Then the man turned, walked to his horse, and mounted up. His remaining men followed suit, and together they rode back down the trail. Disappearing into the forest, Marcus closed the door, barred it, and turned to find Marianne leaning against the wall, her whole body shaking with delayed reaction. The colt slipped from her fingers and clattered to the floor, and she slid down to sit with her back against the logs, her face buried in her hands. "It's all right," Marcus said, moving to sit beside her. "You did good, Marianne. You stood up, made them see you as a person, not a thing. That matters. They'll come back," Marianne said, her voice muffled by her hands. "Sullivan won't let this stand, won't let me have the last word. He'll send more men, better men, and next time we might not be so lucky." Marcus didn't contradict her because she was right. This was just the opening move in a longer game, and the stakes were only going to get higher. But looking at Marianne sitting there, exhausted and scared but unbroken, Marcus made a decision. He wasn't going to wait for Sullivan to make the next move, wasn't going to sit in this cabin, playing defense, until their luck ran out. "Then we don't wait for them," Marcus said. "We take the fight to Sullivan, make him answer for what he's done. But first we need help, and I know where to find it." Marianne looked up, confusion and hope warring in her expression. "Help from who?" Marcus stood, offered her his hand and pulled her to her feet. "From people who understand that some debts can't be paid with money," he said. "From people who remember what it means to stand against cruelty, even when the odds are impossible." He moved to the corner of the cabin, pulled up a loose floorboard, and retrieved a small wooden box he'd kept hidden for years. Inside was a collection of items from his past, a medal from his time in the territorial militia, a photograph of his mother, and a leather-bound journal filled with names and addresses, contacts he'd made over the years. People who owed him favors or simply shared his sense of justice. Marcus flipped through the pages, found what he was looking for, and tapped the entry with his finger. "There's a man in Silver Hill, former Army scout named Thomas Bridger. He runs a freight company now, but he's got connections, knows people throughout the territory. If anyone can help us build a case against Sullivan, gather evidence that'll stand up in court, or at least in the court of public opinion, it's him." Marianne studied Marcus's face, seeing the determination there, the shift from defensive survivor to active combatant. "You'd do that?" she asked quietly. "Risk everything, your home, your life, just to help me fight back?" Marcus closed the journal, looked her straight in the eye, and spoke the simple truth. "I already did that the moment I cut those ropes," he said. "This is just finishing what I started." They left the cabin before dawn the next morning, taking only what they could carry on horseback and what they'd need to survive a hard ride through mountain country. Marcus saddled Sage and a second horse, a sturdy roan gelding he'd been saving for trading, and loaded them with provisions, ammunition, bedrolls, and the documents he'd compiled over the past weeks. Marianne wore men's clothes, her hair tucked up under a hat, a rifle across her saddle, and the colt at her hip. To anyone watching from a distance, she might have passed for a young ranch hand. Just another rider in a territory full of them. The ride to Silver Hill would take 3 days if they pushed hard. Longer if they had to avoid trouble or cover their tracks. Marcus chose a route that took them along high ridges and through dense timber, staying off the main trails where Wade's men might be watching. The terrain was brutal, all steep climbs and treacherous descents, but it offered concealment, and right now that mattered more than comfort. They rode in silence for the first few hours, both of them scanning the forest for signs of pursuit, listening for sounds that didn't belong. The morning was cold and clear, the kind of weather that made everything sharp and vivid, every pine needle distinct, every bird call carrying for miles. Marcus set a steady pace, not so fast as to exhaust the horses, but fast enough to put distance between them and anyone who might be following. By midday, they'd covered nearly 15 miles, climbing up through a series of switchbacks that brought them to a high meadow ringed with granite outcroppings. Marcus called a halt, dismounted, and led the horses to a small stream that cut through the grass. While the animals drank, he pulled out his field glasses and spent 10 minutes studying the valley below, looking for dust clouds, for movement, for anything that suggested they weren't alone. Marianne sat on a flat rock, chewing on a piece of jerky, her eyes never leaving the tree line. She'd been quiet all morning, not the comfortable silence they'd developed at the cabin, but something heavier, more contemplative. When Marcus finished his surveillance and came to sit beside her, she finally spoke. "What if Bridger won't help?" she asked. "What if we ride all this way, and he decides it's not his problem, not worth the risk?" Marcus pulled out his own jerky, tore off a piece with his teeth. "Then we find someone else," he said. "And if nobody helps, we do it ourselves. But I don't think that'll happen. Tom Bridger is a lot of things. Stubborn, opinionated, impossible to work with when he's got his mind set. But he's not the kind of man who turns away from a fight when the cause is just." "You trust him," Marianne said, and it wasn't quite a question. "I trust that he'll do what he thinks is right," Marcus replied. "And I trust that once he hears your story, once he understands what Sullivan is, he'll see this the same way I do, as something that can't be ignored." They rested for another 20 minutes, then mounted up and continued east, following game trails that wound through stands of aspen and across rocky slopes where the horses had to pick their way carefully between boulders. The sun climbed higher, the temperature rose, and Marcus felt sweat soaking through his shirt despite the altitude. Behind him, Marianne rode with the kind of focused concentration that came from understanding the stakes, from knowing that every mile they covered was another mile closer to either salvation or ruin. Late in the afternoon, they descended into a narrow canyon where a creek ran fast and cold over smooth stones. Marcus led them upstream for half a mile, then turned off onto a barely visible path that climbed the canyon wall. It was a route he'd used years ago when he was still doing scout work for the army. A hidden trail that led to a small cave system where they could spend the night, concealed from view. The cave was exactly as Marcus remembered it, a shallow opening in the rock face that went back maybe 20 feet, high enough to stand in, wide enough for 2 people and their gear. There was evidence of old fires near the entrance, charcoal and ash from travelers who'd used this place over the years, and Marcus quickly determined that no one had been here recently. He led the horses inside, unsaddled them, and set about making camp while Marianne gathered firewood from the surrounding forest. By the time full darkness fell, they had a small fire burning near the cave entrance, positioned so the smoke would dissipate against the rock ceiling before drifting outside. Marcus heated water for coffee and warmed up beans and salt pork in a pan, simple food that tasted like a feast after a day in the saddle. They ate in the flickering firelight, their shadows dancing across the cave walls, and for a while neither of them spoke. It was Marianne who broke the silence, her voice soft but steady. "Tell me about Thomas Bridger," she said. "How do you know him? Why do you think he'll help?" Marcus set his empty plate aside, poured himself more coffee from the battered pot. "Met him during the war, or what passed for war out here. Skirmishes between army units and various tribal groups. Tom was a civilian scout, one of the best, could track anything on 2 legs or 4, read terrain like most men read newspapers. I was assigned to his unit for about 6 months, and we worked well together, understood each other without needing to talk everything to death." He paused, sipped his coffee, the bitter taste grounding him in the present, even as he reached back into memory. There was an incident. A village that got caught between 2 forces, civilians who had nothing to do with any of it, but ended up paying the price anyway. Tom and we tried to stop it, tried to get people to see reason. But sometimes reason doesn't matter when blood's up and everyone's looking for revenge. We managed to get some folks out. Maybe 20 people, mostly women and children, got them to safety before the worst happened. Marianne listened intently, her face shadowed in the firelight. "And after that?" she asked. "After that, Tom left the army, said he'd had enough of watching good intentions turn into bad outcomes. He settled in Silver Hill, started running freight, built up a business. But he never forgot what we saw, never stopped believing that sometimes you have to stand between cruelty and its victims, even when it costs you. That's why I think he'll help, because this is exactly the kind of fight he understands." Marianne nodded slowly, absorbing this. "And if he says no? If he thinks it's too dangerous or too complicated?" Marcus met her gaze across the fire, his expression serious. "Then we keep going anyway," he said. Because some things are worth fighting for regardless of the odds, and you're one of those things, Marianne. Your freedom, your right to live without fear, your chance to be something other than what men like Sullivan tried to make you. That's worth any risk. The words hung in the air between them, and Marcus saw something shift in Marianne's expression, a softening, a recognition of the weight behind what he'd just said. She looked down at her hands, at the calluses that had formed from 2 weeks of hard work and harder lessons. And when she looked up again, there were tears tracking down her cheeks. "No one's ever fought for me before," she said quietly. "My father sold me to Pemberton because it was convenient, because it made him look good in front of his congregation. Pemberton sold me to Sullivan because I was easier to trade than the money he owed. Even before all that, when I was just a girl, I was something to be managed, controlled, kept in line. But you barely know me, and you're willing to risk everything. I don't understand why." Marcus stood, walked to the cave entrance and stared out at the stars, beginning to emerge in the darkening sky. "My mother used to say that we're all connected, that what happens to one person echoes through everyone around them. She believed that standing by and doing nothing when you see injustice makes you complicit in it, makes you part of the problem. I guess I believe that too, or at least I try to live like it's true." He turned back to face Marianne, his silhouette backlit by starlight. "But it's more than philosophy, Marianne. It's personal. When I found you in that wagon, when I saw what they'd done to you, something in me recognized something in you. 2 people who didn't quite fit in the world they were born into, who had to make their own place on the margins. Maybe that's presumptuous. Maybe I'm seeing connections that aren't really there. But I know what it's like to be treated as less than human, to have people look at you and see only what they want to see, not who you actually are. And I decided a long time ago that I wouldn't let that happen to anyone else if I could prevent it." Marianne stood as well, moved to join him at the cave entrance. They stood side by side, looking out at the vast darkness of the mountains, at the pinprick lights of distant stars. "Thank you," she said simply, and the 2 words carried more weight than any grand declaration could have. They kept watch in shifts that night, 2 hours on, 2 hours off. Marcus taking the first shift, while Marianne slept wrapped in her bedroll near the dying fire. The night was quiet, just the usual sounds of the wilderness, owls hunting, small animals rustling through the undergrowth, the occasional distant howl of a wolf. Marcus sat at the cave entrance, his rifle across his knees, and thought about what lay ahead. Silver Hill was a rough town, the kind of place where money talked and questions were discouraged. Thomas Bridger had built his freight business by being reliable and discreet, by moving goods for people who valued both qualities. Getting him involved in this fight would mean asking him to risk not just his safety, but his livelihood, his reputation, everything he'd built over the past decade. It was a lot to ask, and Marcus knew it. But he also knew that Tom Bridger was the kind of man who understood the difference between legal and right, who knew that sometimes the law failed and people had to step in where institutions wouldn't. When Marcus's shift ended, he woke Marianne gently, handed her the rifle, and settled into his own bedroll. Sleep came quickly, the exhaustion of the day's ride catching up with him, and he dreamed of his mother teaching him to track deer through snow, showing him how to read the story, written in prints and broken branches, how to understand the world through observation rather than assumption. The second day of riding was harder than the first. The trail descended from the high country into a series of box canyons that required constant backtracking and careful navigation. Marcus consulted the mental map he'd built over years of traveling this territory, adjusting their route to avoid settlements where they might be recognized or remembered. They saw no one, which was both a relief and a concern. The emptiness of the landscape making Marcus wonder if Wade had circled ahead, if they were riding into an ambush without knowing it. But the day passed without incident, and by evening they'd covered another 20 miles, putting them within striking distance of Silver Hill. They made camp in a grove of cottonwoods near a spring, and Marcus took the opportunity to clean and check their weapons, making sure everything was in working order. Marianne practiced her draw, the motion smoother now than it had been 2 weeks ago, and Marcus felt that flicker of pride again, watching her transform from victim to fighter. "Tomorrow we reach town," Marcus said as they ate their evening meal. "Once we're there, you'll need to stay out of sight while I make contact with Bridger. If Sullivan has people watching for you, showing your face in public would be a mistake." Marianne frowned but nodded. "I hate hiding," she said. "Feels like going backward, like being that scared girl in the wagon again." "It's not hiding, it's tactics," Marcus replied. "We show them what they expect to see, me arriving alone. No threat, no complications. Then once I've secured Bridger's help, we reveal the truth on our terms, in a setting where Sullivan's people can't just snatch you off the street. It's about control, about making them react to us, instead of the other way around." They reached Silver Hill late the following afternoon, riding in from the north along a road that bypassed the main approach. The town had grown since Marcus's last visit. New buildings crowding the main street, a second saloon, a proper general store with glass windows. Progress, some would call it, though Marcus had his doubts about whether more people and more buildings really constituted improvement. He left Marianne hidden in a stand of trees about a mile outside town, positioned where she could see anyone approaching, but where she'd be invisible from the road. "If I'm not back by full dark, something's gone wrong," Marcus told her. "If that happens, you ride hard for the Territorial Marshal's office in Cedar Falls. It's 2 days southeast. Tell them everything. Give them the documentation I showed you. They might not believe you, but at least you'll be on record." Marianne gripped his arm, her face tight with worry. "Be careful," she said. "Wade might have people here watching for you." "I'm always careful," Marcus replied and urged Sage toward town. Thomas Bridger's freight office sat at the edge of Silver Hill's commercial district. A sturdy building with a loading dock and a corral for the draft horses that pulled his wagons. Marcus tied Sage to the hitching post outside and entered through the main door, a bell jingling overhead to announce his arrival. The interior was cluttered but organized, stacks of manifests on a long counter, shelves lined with samples of goods Bridger could procure. Everything from mining equipment to luxury items ordered from back east. A young clerk looked up from his ledger, started to offer a greeting, then stopped when he got a good look at Marcus. "We're closing soon," the clerk said, his tone shifting from welcoming to wary. "If you've got business, it'll have to wait until tomorrow." Marcus ignored the clerk and walked past him toward the back office, where he could see a familiar figure bent over a desk covered in paperwork. "Tom," Marcus called out. "Got a minute?" Thomas Bridger looked up, his weathered face registering surprise that quickly turned to genuine pleasure. He was a big man, taller than Marcus by a couple inches and broader through the shoulders, with iron-grey hair and a beard that had gone completely white. He stood, came around the desk and clasped Marcus's hand in a grip that could crush stone. "Marcus Darkwater, you old ghost," Bridger said, his voice a deep rumble. "Thought maybe you'd finally gotten yourself killed living out there in the wilderness. What brings you to civilization?" Marcus glanced at the clerk, who was watching with obvious suspicion. "Need to talk, Private," Marcus said. "It's important, Tom. Maybe the most important thing I've ever asked you for." Bridger's expression shifted, the jovial reunion replaced by serious attention. He looked at the clerk, jerked his thumb toward the door. "Charles, head home. We'll finish the inventory tomorrow." The clerk protested, started to argue about leaving early, but one look from Bridger silenced him. He gathered his things and left, the bell jingling again as the door closed. Bridger waited until the sound of footsteps faded, then gestured Marcus into the back office and shut the door. "All right," Bridger said, settling into his chair and fixing Marcus with a penetrating stare. "Talk, and don't leave anything out, because I can tell from your face that whatever this is, it's bad." Marcus told him everything. About finding Marianne in the wagon, about the note and the scars, about Wade's attack and their decision to fight back rather than run. He laid out the documentation, the names, the connections he'd pieced together between Pemberton and Sullivan, and the network of men who traded in human misery. He spoke for nearly an hour, and Bridger listened without interruption, his face growing darker with each revelation. When Marcus finished, Bridger was silent for a long moment, staring at the papers spread across his desk. Finally, he looked up, and Marcus saw something in his old friend's eyes that he recognized. The same cold fury that had driven them both to try saving that village years ago. "Sullivan," Bridger said, and the name came out like a curse. "I know who he is. Everyone in the territory does. Railroad money, political connections, the kind of man who thinks laws are suggestions for people less important than him. Taking him on, Marcus, that's not a fight you win. That's a fight you survive if you're lucky." "I know," Marcus said quietly. "But I'm asking anyway. Will you help?" Bridger stood, walked to his window and looked out at the darkening street. "You remember what I told you after that village?" he asked. "After we got those people out?" "You said some fights are worth losing," Marcus replied. "That's right," Bridger said. "Some fights are worth losing because the alternative, doing nothing, letting evil happen without resistance, that's worse than any defeat. So yes, Marcus, I'll help. But we do this smart. We build a case that can't be ignored. We make enough noise that even Sullivan's money and connections can't make it disappear. And we prepare for the backlash, because it's coming whether we win or lose." Marcus felt tension he hadn't known he was carrying release from his shoulders. "Thank you, Tom," he said. Bridger turned from the window, extended his hand again. "Don't thank me yet," he said. "This is just beginning, and it's going to get worse before it gets better. Now where's this woman you've been protecting? I want to hear her story directly, and I want to look her in the eye when she tells it. Because if we're going to war, I need to know what we're fighting for." Thomas Bridger's plan unfolded over the next 3 weeks with the careful precision of a military campaign. He'd secured a room for Marianne above a general store owned by his sister, a formidable woman named Catherine, who asked no questions and made it clear that anyone trying to get past her would regret the attempt. Meanwhile, Marcus and Bridger worked from the freight office, compiling evidence, tracking down witnesses, building a case that would stand up not just in a court of law, but in the court of public opinion. The first breakthrough came when Bridger located a former employee of Charles Pemberton's household, a housekeeper named Mrs. Eleanor Shaw, who'd been dismissed after she'd witnessed too much. She was living in a boarding house on the edge of town, working as a seamstress, trying to rebuild a life that Pemberton's cruelty had nearly destroyed. When Marcus and Bridger approached her, she was suspicious at first, afraid that talking would bring retribution. But when Marianne sat down with her, when Mrs. Shaw saw the scars and heard the story told in Marianne's own steady voice, something changed. "I saw things in that house," Mrs. Shaw said, her hands trembling as she held a cup of tea Catherine had brought. "Things that kept me awake at night, things I tried to convince myself weren't as bad as they seemed. But they were. Mr. Pemberton, he had a ledger, kept it locked in his study. I saw it once when I was cleaning, saw pages filled with names and numbers. It wasn't accounts, it was people. Women mostly, a few men, all of them listed with prices beside their names like they were livestock." Bridger leaned forward, his voice gentle but insistent. "Do you know what happened to that ledger? Is it still in Denver?" Mrs. Shaw shook her head. "When Mr. Pemberton fled, he took it with him. But I remember some of the names. And I remember seeing correspondence between him and Mr. Sullivan, letters arranging transfers, discussing payments, using language that seemed like business, but was really about buying and selling human beings. Over the following days, they tracked down more witnesses, people who'd been peripherally involved in Sullivan's operations, drivers who'd transported cargo they weren't supposed to question, clerks who'd processed paperwork that didn't quite add up. Each piece of testimony added another layer to the picture they were building, a systematic network of exploitation that stretched across 3 territories and involved some of the wealthiest, most powerful men in the region. But evidence alone wasn't enough. Bridger understood that going after Sullivan through official channels would be slow and uncertain. corrupted by money and influence at every level. What they needed was something more immediate, more public, a confrontation that would force Sullivan to show his hand in a setting where he couldn't simply make problems disappear. Bridger proposed a territorial assembly meeting scheduled for the following month in Denver, a public forum where citizens could bring grievances before elected officials and the press. If they could get Marianne's story heard there, if they could present their evidence in a way that couldn't be ignored or suppressed, they might force action. "It's risky," Bridger admitted during one of their late-night planning sessions in his office. "Sullivan will have people at that assembly, might even be there himself. If he realizes what we're doing before Marianne gets to speak, he could shut it down, or worse." Marcus studied the map of Denver spread across the desk, marking locations, planning routes. "Then we don't give him time to realize," he said. "We arrive the day of the assembly, get Marianne inside before anyone knows she's there, and once she's at that podium with witnesses and press watching, Sullivan won't be able to touch her without exposing himself." Marianne, who'd been sitting quietly in the corner listening to them strategize, finally spoke up. "And if he doesn't care about exposure? If he decides that silencing me is worth whatever consequences come after?" It was the question they'd all been avoiding, the central risk that made this entire plan feel like walking a tightrope over a canyon. Marcus met her gaze across the room, saw the fear there but also the determination, and he made a decision. "Then we make sure you're protected," Marcus said. "Not just by me and Tom, but by people Sullivan can't intimidate or buy off. I'm going to reach out to some old contacts, former army scouts, territorial rangers, men who understand duty and won't back down from a fight. We'll have them positioned throughout that assembly hall, watching every entrance, every exit. Sullivan makes a move, he'll find himself surrounded by people who won't hesitate to put him down." Bridger nodded slowly, appreciating the logic. "I can contribute to that," he said. "I've got drivers and guards who work for me. Good men who hate what Sullivan represents. Give me a week, and I'll have a dozen armed and ready." The plan took shape over countless hours of detailed preparation, contingencies within contingencies, backup plans for the backup plans. They arranged for safe houses along the route to Denver, secured transportation that couldn't be easily traced, and compiled their evidence into a presentation that was clear, compelling, and impossible to refute. Marianne practiced her testimony, learning how to tell her story in a way that was both emotionally powerful and factually precise. How to answer hostile questions without breaking. How to stand in front of strangers and speak truth to power. During this time, Marcus watched Marianne continue her transformation. The frightened, broken woman from the wagon was gone, replaced by someone harder, sharper, forged in the crucible of survival and purpose. She trained every morning with the Colt, her accuracy improving until she could hit targets at 30 yards with consistency. She studied maps and documents, memorizing names and dates, preparing herself not just to testify, but to withstand cross-examination from lawyers who would try to discredit her. An evening, about a week before they were scheduled to leave for Denver, Marcus found Marianne sitting on the roof of Catherine's store, watching the sun set over the mountains. He climbed up to join her, settling onto the wooden shingles with his back against the chimney. "You ready for this?" he asked, knowing it was a foolish question but needing to ask anyway. Marianne didn't answer immediately, just watched the sky turn from gold to orange to deep purple. "I don't know if anyone can be ready for something like this," she said finally. "Standing up in front of all those people, reliving everything that happened, knowing Sullivan might be sitting right there watching me. It terrifies me, Marcus, but you know what terrifies me more?" "Oh, what?" "Demi, the thought of not doing it. The thought of spending the rest of my life looking over my shoulder, wondering when someone's going to show up and drag me back into that nightmare. This is my chance to end it. To take back control, not just of my life, but of my story. Whatever happens in Denver, at least I'll know I tried." Marcus nodded, understanding completely. "For what it's worth," he said, "I've seen a lot of brave people in my time, soldiers who charged into gunfire, scouts who went into hostile territory alone, men and women who faced impossible odds without flinching. But what you're doing, standing up after everything you've been through and choosing to fight instead of hide, that takes a different kind of courage, the kind that matters most. Marianne turned to look at him, and in the fading light Marcus saw tears tracking down her cheeks. "Thank you for believing in me," she said quietly, "for seeing me as more than just a victim, for giving me the chance to be something else." "You were always something else," Marcus replied. "I just helped you remember it." The journey to Denver took 4 days, traveling with Bridger's freight caravan as cover, Marianne hidden among crates and supplies, Marcus and a dozen armed guards positioned throughout the convoy. They moved at a steady pace, avoiding the main roads when possible, stopping only at locations Bridger had vetted personally. There were tense moments, riders approaching from unexpected directions, strangers asking questions at supply stops, but nothing materialized into actual threat. They arrived in Denver on a gray morning when fog hung thick over the city, turning the brick buildings into vague shadows and muffling the usual cacophony of urban noise. Bridger directed the convoy to a warehouse on the outskirts owned by one of his business partners, a secure location where they could finalize their preparations without interference. The territorial assembly was scheduled for 2 that afternoon, which gave them roughly 4 hours to position their people and get Marianne inside. Marcus gathered the assembled guards in the warehouse, men he'd known from his army days and others Bridger had recruited, hard-faced individuals who understood the stakes. "Sullivan will have people watching the assembly hall," Marcus told them, his voice carrying in the cavernous space. "Your job is to identify them, keep track of their positions, and be ready to intervene if things go wrong. We're not looking for a fight, but we won't back down from one either." Marianne Hollis gets to that podium, tells her story, and leaves that building safely. Everything else is secondary. The men nodded, checked their weapons, and dispersed to take up positions. Marcus turned to find Marianne standing nearby, dressed in a simple but dignified dress Catherine had made for her, her hair pulled back severely, her face composed but pale. She looked like what she was, a woman preparing to face her demons in the most public way possible. "How do I look?" she asked, and there was a tremor in her voice that betrayed her nervousness. "Like someone who refuses to be broken," Marcus said. "Like someone who's going to change everything." The Territorial Assembly Hall was a grand building in the heart of Denver, all marble columns and vaulted ceilings, designed to impress and intimidate in equal measure. Marcus and Bridger escorted Marianne through a side entrance, avoiding the main doors, where journalists and curious citizens were already gathering. Inside, the hall was filling rapidly. Rows of wooden benches occupied by merchants, miners, ranchers, and politicians, all waiting to hear grievances and debates about the future of the territory. Marcus spotted Sullivan almost immediately. The railroad baron sat in the front row, surrounded by well-dressed associates and lawyers, his expression one of bored superiority, as if the proceedings were beneath him, but he was obligated to attend for appearances. He was younger than Marcus had expected, maybe 45, with slicked-back dark hair and eyes that reminded Marcus of a snake evaluating prey. Next to Sullivan sat Clayton Wade, the hired gun who'd attacked the cabin, his presence confirming that Sullivan knew something was coming, but perhaps didn't know exactly what. The assembly chairman, a portly man with elaborate whiskers and a voice that carried like a foghorn, called the meeting to order. Various speakers took the podium, presenting complaints about water rights, mining claims, railroad monopolies, the usual grievances of people trying to build lives in territory where law was still being written. Marcus waited, positioned near the side wall where he could watch both Sullivan and the exits, his hand never far from the Colt at his hip. When Marianne's turn came, she walked to the podium with her head high, her hands clasped to keep them from shaking. The hall quieted as people recognized that this speaker was different, younger than most petitioners, female in a gathering dominated by men, carrying herself with a tension that suggested her testimony would be anything but routine. "My name is Marianne Hollis," she began, her voice clear and strong, despite the fear Marcus knew she was feeling. "And I'm here to speak about a crime that exists in the shadows of our society, hidden behind wealth and respectability, destroying lives while the law looks the other way." She told her story then, every detail laid out in careful, devastating prose. The marriage to Pemberton, the abuse, the sale to Sullivan, the scars carved into her back. She described the network of exploitation she'd glimpsed, the ledgers and transactions that reduced human beings to commodities. And she named names: Pemberton, Sullivan, Wade, and a dozen others, men of influence and position who'd built their fortunes on suffering. The hall was absolutely silent, every person riveted by the testimony unfolding before them. Journalists scribbled furiously in their notebooks, photographers prepared their cameras, and gradually Marcus saw Sullivan's expression change from bored superiority to something approaching rage. When Marianne finished, she produced the documents they'd compiled, holding them up for everyone to see. "I have evidence," she said. "Testimony from witnesses, financial records, correspondence that proves these men are operating a systematic trade in human beings. I'm asking this assembly, I'm asking the territorial governor, I'm asking anyone who cares about justice to investigate these crimes and hold the guilty accountable." Sullivan stood abruptly, his face flushed with anger. "This is slander," he shouted, his voice cutting through the hall. "Lies told by a disturbed woman who's clearly mentally unstable. I've never seen this person before in my life, and I demand that she be removed immediately for making false accusations." But before anyone could respond, Mrs. Eleanor Shaw stood from her seat near the back, her voice trembling but determined. "It's not lies," she said. "I worked in Charles Pemberton's household. I saw what he did to her. I saw the ledgers, the correspondence with you. Mr. Sullivan, every word she's spoken is true." Then others stood, the witnesses Bridger had gathered, each one adding their voice to Marianne's, corroborating her story, filling in details that made the picture undeniable. Sullivan looked around wildly, realizing that this wasn't just one woman's accusation, but a coordinated exposure, a trap he'd walked into without knowing. Wade moved toward the podium, his hand going to his coat where Marcus knew he kept a pistol, but Marcus was faster. He stepped into Wade's path, his own hand on his Colt, and the message was clear: "Touch her and die." Wade stopped, his eyes meeting Marcus's, and in that moment some calculation passed through the hired gun's mind, some recognition that this fight was lost before it started. The assembly chairman, sensing that the situation was spiraling toward violence, banged his gavel repeatedly. "Order," he shouted. "Mr. Sullivan, sit down. Miss Hollis, your testimony is entered into the record. This assembly will refer these allegations to the territorial attorney for investigation. Guards ensure that all parties remain present until law enforcement arrives." What followed was chaos of a different sort. Journalists mobbing Marianne with questions, territorial marshals arriving to take statements, Sullivan and his associates being escorted from the hall under heavy guard, while he shouted threats and promises of legal retaliation. Marcus stayed close to Marianne throughout, a protective presence that made it clear she wasn't alone, wasn't vulnerable despite what she'd just put herself through. By evening, the story was spreading through Denver like wildfire, newspaper boys shouting headlines about railroad barons and human trafficking, editorial writers calling for immediate investigation and prosecution. Bridger's warehouse had become an impromptu command center, filled with lawyers offering to help, former victims coming forward with their own stories, and territorial officials trying to get ahead of a scandal that threatened to topple some of the territory's most powerful figures. Marcus found Marianne sitting in a quiet corner of the warehouse, exhausted and overwhelmed by everything that had happened. He sat down beside her, offered her a cup of water, and they sat in silence for a long moment. "Did we win?" Marianne asked finally, her voice small and uncertain. Marcus considered the question carefully. "We started something," he said. "Whether it's a win depends on what happens next. on whether the law actually follows through, on whether public pressure forces action. But you stood up, Marianne. You told your truth in a way that can't be ignored or suppressed. That matters regardless of what comes after. Marianne nodded slowly, and then for the first time since Marcus had known her, she smiled. Not a big smile, not joy exactly, but something quieter, deeper, the satisfaction of someone who'd faced their demons and survived. "I'm not afraid anymore," she said. "Whatever Sullivan tries, whatever happens with the investigation, I'm not afraid, because I know now that I can fight back, that I'm not helpless." The weeks that followed brought both vindication and frustration. The territorial attorney, under intense public pressure, launched a formal investigation into Sullivan's operations. Several of his associates were arrested, ledgers were seized, and gradually the full scope of the trafficking network began to emerge. Sullivan himself fled Denver before he could be taken into custody, disappearing into the maze of rail lines and safe houses his money had built. Clayton Wade was arrested but released on bail and promptly vanished as well. For Marianne, the aftermath was complicated. She testified again, this time in depositions and preliminary hearings, her story picked apart by defense lawyers looking for inconsistencies. The scars on her back were photographed as evidence, a violation that felt almost as invasive as the original injury. But through it all, she maintained her composure, supported by Marcus and Bridger and a growing network of advocates who recognized her courage. 6 months after the assembly, Marianne made a decision. She would return to Marcus's cabin, not as a refugee or a victim, but as a partner. Together, they would work the land, build something sustainable, create a life defined by choice rather than circumstance. Marcus agreed without hesitation, understanding that for Marianne, the cabin represented not captivity, but the first place she'd felt safe. The beginning of her transformation. On the day they left Denver to ride back into the mountains, Marianne stood on the street outside Bridger's office, looking at the city that had been the site of both her greatest trauma and her greatest triumph. "Do you think they'll ever catch Sullivan?" she asked Marcus. "Maybe," Marcus said. "Or maybe he'll spend the rest of his life running, looking over his shoulder, knowing that his empire is gone and his name is synonymous with evil." Either way, he lost what mattered most. Power built on cruelty doesn't last, Marianne. It collapses eventually. And the fall is always hard. They rode out together, 2 figures on horseback, heading toward the high country, toward a future they would build together through work and patience, and the quiet determination to be more than what the world had tried to make them. The mountains rose before them, massive and eternal, and Marcus felt something settle in his chest, a sense of rightness, of purpose fulfilled. Behind them, Denver continued its transformation, newspapers still running stories about the Sullivan scandal. Lawyers and judges working through the legal complexities of dismantling a criminal enterprise that had operated with impunity for years. Change was slow, justice uncertain, but seeds had been planted, conversations started, and sometimes that was enough. When they reached the cabin 3 days later, Marianne dismounted and stood looking at it for a long moment. The building where she'd arrived as cargo and left as a person, where she'd learned to shoot and to trust and to imagine a future beyond survival. Marcus stood beside her waiting, and finally she turned to him with that small, quiet smile he'd come to recognize. "I'm home," she said, and the word carried weight, meaning the simple truth of someone who'd finally found a place where they belonged. Marcus nodded, understanding completely. "Yeah," he said. "You are." They went inside together and Marcus built a fire while Marianne unpacked their supplies. The familiar routines reasserted themselves. Coffee brewing, food prepared, the comfortable silence of 2 people who no longer needed to fill every moment with words. As evening fell and the fire burned low, they sat across from each other at the worn wooden table, and Marcus raised his cup in a quiet toast. "To surviving," he said. Marianne raised her own cup, met his eyes across the table. "To more than surviving," she corrected gently. "To living." And in that moment, in a cabin tucked away in the Colorado Rockies, two people who'd been broken by the world found something rare and precious, not happiness exactly, but peace. The knowledge that they'd fought for what mattered and emerged on the other side, changed but undefeated. The scars remained, physical and emotional, reminders of battles fought and survived. But they no longer defined everything, no longer limited what was possible. Outside, the mountains stood eternal, and the stars emerged one by one in the darkening sky. The world continued its endless cycle of cruelty and kindness, of people who harmed and people who healed. But here, in this small corner of wilderness, Marcus Darkwater and Marianne Hollis had carved out something different. A space where mercy trumped vengeance, where standing up mattered more than winning, where two damaged souls could build something whole. And maybe, Marcus thought as he watched Marianne staring into the fire with that new strength in her eyes, maybe that was the point all along. Not to defeat evil completely, which was impossible, but to resist it person by person, choice by choice, to stand between cruelty and its victims, and refuse to move. His mother had been right all those years ago. Bearing witness mattered. Standing up mattered, and sometimes, if you were very lucky, it changed not just the person you saved, but yourself as well. The fire crackled, the wind whispered through the pines, and in the quiet of that mountain cabin, two people who'd found each other through the worst of circumstances began the slow, patient work of building a life worth living. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.